476 AD, Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, has just been deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer. Now, the traditional history books say that this was the end of the Roman Empire, but really what happened to Rome in 476 AD is nothing compared to what happened in 284 AD, because in 284 AD, Rome nearly collapsed completely. And if it wasn't for one man, well, then the entire future of Europe could have been drastically different. So let's talk about it. This is part 4 of our series on the fall of the Roman Empire. If you haven't already seen it, then I highly recommend watching part 3 first, because it'll make this video much easier to understand. By the year 284 AD, the Roman Empire was in a very bad way. The empire was being attacked from all sides by Germanic tribes. The economy was unstable. There were civil wars happening left and right. And to top it all off, the Roman emperor at the time, Carus, had just died under mysterious circumstances while campaigning against the Goths. And as a result of his sudden death, the empire was now being threatened by a Gothic invasion force led by the warlord Cneva. Now, the most obvious solution would have simply been to call in the legions of Rome to put down this rebellion. But there was a big problem with that. See, up until Carus's death, he had spent most of his reign trying to curb the power of the Roman army. You see, after years of civil wars, Carus decided that the best way to secure his rule over the empire would be to get rid of the army's power. He did this in a number of ways. For example, he broke up military alliances with neighboring kingdoms, he reduced the size of the army, and he even began stripping away their privileges. In fact, he went so far as to take complete control of the finances of the military, and rather than giving it to the generals and officers of the army, he instead gave it to civilian bureaucrats who didn't know the first thing about logistics or supply lines. And so when the Gothic War erupted into full-scale rebellion, the Roman army was in no shape to fight back. And so Rome was in desperate need of a military savior. Enter Aurelius Diocletian, a low-ranking military officer who was in charge of defending the province of Pannonia. When he heard about the Gothic invasions, he immediately marched his men to meet the enemy. Now, according to the historians, Diocletian was an amazing military commander. Within a few weeks of taking command of the army, he was able to turn the tide of battle around and force the Goths into a stalemate. This impressed the people, the Praetorian Guard, and most importantly, Diocletian's fellow soldiers, and so they proclaimed him emperor. But there was one problem. There was already an emperor, Carus's son Numerian. Although he was only 21 years old and had no real experience in ruling the empire, Diocletian refused to share power with him and forced Numerian to retire to a villa where he would live out the rest of his life. After this, he marched on Rome and took control of the empire. And this is why we remember him as one of the most important emperors in Roman history. In order to prevent another civil war, Diocletian divided the empire once again into two halves. The eastern half would be ruled from Nicomedia, and the western half would be ruled from Milan. The reason he chose these cities is because they were strategically located in the middle of their respective regions, which meant that any problems that came up could be dealt with more easily. Not to mention, thanks to the Silk Road, both cities had easy access to wealth. Next, in order to better govern the vast Roman lands, he split each region into smaller dioceses and placed a prefect over each one. These prefects were appointed by the emperor, meaning that they were loyal to him and not some regional senator. Next, he also established a civil service whose sole job was to collect taxes. This made it easier for the government to pay its soldiers and fund public works programs. And finally, he reorganized the military by creating a professional standing army. Unlike the army of the late Republic, this army was composed entirely of volunteers, which increased morale. And to help keep everything together, he built roads, established postal systems, and reformed the currency. And so in less than 50 years, the Roman Empire went from this to this. But wait a minute, you might be thinking something isn't quite right here. We've all learned that Diocletian saved the Roman Empire, but that can't possibly be true. I mean, Rome fell in less than 100 years after his reign. Well, you're right. Rome did eventually fall, but Diocletian did save it from collapsing in 284 AD. And actually, he should be given even more credit than that, because he was actually the first emperor to successfully divide the empire. After him, the empire was reunited twice, once under his chosen successor Maximian, and once under his grandson Constantius. But both times the empire was split up again shortly after each ruler died. However, after Diocletian retired, his tetrarchy became the foundation of the medieval world. And whether we're talking about the Eastern Roman Empire or the Western Roman Empire, almost every single king, duke, lord, and lady who ever ruled those lands can trace their lineage back to Diocletian. And this is why he is known as the founder of the medieval world. So then if Diocletian did save the Roman Empire, then why did it fall so soon after he stepped down? Well, part of the reason is that Diocletian's reforms made the empire too stable. By making the empire efficient and effective, he actually made it so that it could continue without him. And this may have been his ultimate goal all along. You see, the truth is, Diocletian grew tired of being emperor. According to historian Edward Champlin, Diocletian wanted to live a life of luxury and pleasure rather than a life of duty and service. And so when he retired in 305 BC, he left instructions that the empire was to be ruled jointly by his 4 subordinates. But of course, this caused a lot of friction between the rulers, and soon enough civil war erupted once again. So then Diocletian must have been disappointed to see that his work undone so quickly, right? Well, maybe. But let's not forget that Diocletian was a pragmatist. He knew that being emperor wasn't an easy job and that being successful required sacrifice. And so when he noticed that his system was continuing to grow even after he stepped down, he probably wasn't angry, but instead satisfied. In fact, he probably looked at the other emperors and thought, good, let them have it. It's time for me to enjoy the spoils of victory. And to top it all off, the retirement of Diocletian may have been a blessing in disguise for the empire as a whole. You see, since the empire had become so big, it was becoming harder and harder to effectively rule over it. And this was a huge problem for any aspiring emperor. After all, how could anyone hope to maintain stability over such a large area? And the answer was simple. They couldn't. And this is exactly what happened. As the decades passed, the empire experienced more instability, more corruption, and more barbarian invasions. And this led many historians to believe that the empire was doomed from the start. But this isn't really true because the Roman Empire lasted another 195 years after Diocletian retired. And this wouldn't have been possible if Rome hadn't been split. So in reality, Diocletian's decision to divide the Roman Empire was the smartest choice that he could have possibly made. And this brings us to the fall of the Roman Empire. When Rome fell in 476 AD, it wasn't just the Western Roman Empire that fell. In fact, the Eastern Roman Empire continued on for another 1,000 years. Now sure, this doesn't change the fact that the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, but it does change the narrative a bit. You see, when we say that Rome fell in 476 AD, we're really referring to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And this isn't really surprising when you think about it, because at its peak, the Eastern Roman Empire was 10 times larger than the Western Roman Empire. And so if Rome fell in 476 AD, then what happened to the Western Roman Empire after 476 AD? Well, the funny thing is that nothing happened. Oh, wait. I'm sorry, I must have gotten my wires crossed. You said what happened to the Eastern Roman Empire after 476 AD. Yeah, I know. Well, when the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire continued on for another 1,000 years. And so if you want to learn about the history of the greatest empire in the world, then stay tuned for our series on the rise and fall of the Eastern Roman Empire.